All right. Chapter 25, The Soundtrack of Sorrow and Subversion. 1988. My mic sounds nice. Check 1. My mic sounds nice. Check 2. Hip hop had arrived. It had been about a decade since it was born in the South Bronx. BET and MTV started airing hip hop shows. The Source magazine hit newsstands that year, beginning its reign as the world's longest running rap periodical. But it was the music itself that was driving change and empowerment. Here are a few songs from that year. Check them out. Slick Rick, Children's Story, Ice-T, Colors, NWA, Straight Outta Compton, Boogie Down Productions, Stop the Violence, Queen Latifah, Wrath of My Madness, Public Enemy, Don't Believe the Hype. It would be Public Enemy that really set the tone the following year. In 1989, they wrote a song that was placed in Spike Lee's Black Rebellion movie, Do the Right Thing. The song was a forceful mantra, an updated version of Stokely Carmichael's Black Power and James Brown's Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. For the new generation of hip-hop heads and rebellious Black teenagers angry about racist mistreatment, it was Public Enemy's Fight the Power. And with all the Black feminist thought, including the work of Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who focused on the intersection between race and sex, women rappers like MC Lyte and Salt and Peppa took their place on the hip-hop stage. Actually, they fared better than women in Hollywood because at least their art was in mass circulation. Aside from Julie Dash's pioneering Daughters of the Dust, Black men were the only ones producing major Black films in 1991. These included illustrious films like Mario Van Peebles' New Jack City, John Singleton's debut anti-racist tragedy Boys in the Hood, and Spike Lee's acclaimed interracial relationship satire Jungle Fever. Black men produced more films in 1991 than during all of the 1980s, but a white man, George Holliday, shot the most influential racial film of the year on March 3rd from the balcony of his Los Angeles apartment. He was filming a 25-year-old Black man, Rodney King, being brutally beaten by 4 Los Angeles police officers. The public, the Black public, broke open. The levees holding back the waters of righteous indignation crumbled under the sight of those officers' batons. How much more can we take? How much more? President Bush danced around the issue, appointed a Black Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, to replace Thurgood Marshall, as if that were supposed to pacify an angry and hurt Black community. And to make matters worse, Clarence Thomas was an assimilationist in the worst way. He saw himself as the king of self-reliance, a pick yourselves up by the bootstraps kind of guy, even though his work as an activist got him into his fancy schools and landed him this fancy job. And to add the racist cherry on top, Clarence Thomas had been accused by a woman named Anita Hill of sexual harassment when she served as his assistant at an earlier job. Nothing was done. No one believed her. In fact, she was persecuted. So in 1991, Angela Davis was reeling. Her year had started with the brutal beating of Rodney King, the cops were on trial at this point, and ended with the verbal lashing of Anita Hill. Thomas was confirmed as a Supreme Court justice anyway. As if the reminder that being Black and being a woman weren't enough of a double whammy, the year also ended for Davis in an unfamiliar place. She had taken a new professorship at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and stepped away from the Communist Party after spending 23 years as the most recognizable communist in America. The party refused to acknowledge the issues that Davis had fought so hard to bring to light: racism, sexism, elitism, all things the Communist Party ultimately took part in perpetuating. So she left. But she didn't jump from communist to Democrat, or rather a new Democrat, as the party was going through a bit of an overhaul, a remix, a revamp, fiscally liberal but tough on welfare and crime. And the man leading this new Democratic Party was a dazzling, well-spoken, and calculating Arkansas governor named Bill Clinton. It was 1992. And by the time the cops who had beaten Rodney King were found not guilty, Clinton had already run away with the Democratic nomination. But who could think about that when America had just told millions of people who had watched the Rodney King beating that those officers had done nothing wrong? So, Black people hit the LA streets in rebellion. It would take 20,000 troops to stop them. Bill Clinton blamed both political parties for failing Black America, while also blaming Black America and calling the people in the midst of the uprising, people in immense pain, lawless vandals. About a month later, Clinton took his campaign to the national conference of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. Though Jackson was widely unpopular among the racist whites whom Clinton was trying to attract to the New Democrats, when Jackson invited the hip-hop artist Sister Souljah to address the conference, the Clinton team saw its political opportunity. The 28-year-old Bronx native had just released 360 Degrees of Power, an anti-racist album so provocative that it made Spike Lee's films and Ice Cube's albums seem like The Cosby Show. And Clinton's response to Sister Souljah was that she was being a racist. It was a political stunt, but it thrilled racist voters and catapulted Clinton to a lead he'd never lose. By the end of 1993, rappers were under attack. They were being criticized from all sides, not just from Bill Clinton. 66-year-old civil rights veteran C. Dolores Tucker and her National Political Congress of Black Women took the media portrayals debate to a new racist level in their strong campaign to ban gangster rap. To her, rap music was setting Black people back. She felt like it was making Black people more violent, more materialistic, more sexual. To Tucker, the music was making its urban Black listeners inferior, though she never said anything about its suburban white listeners. While Tucker focused on shutting down gangster rap, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology historian Evelyn Hammonds mobilized to defend against the defamation of Black womanhood. More than 2,000 Black female scholars from all across the country made their way to MIT's campus on January 13, 1994, for Black Women in the Academy, Defending Our Name, 1894 to 1994. Among them was Angela Davis. She was the conference's closing speaker. She was certainly the nation's most famous Black American woman academic, but more importantly, over the course of her career, she had consistently defended Black women, including those Black women who even some Black women did not want to defend. She had been arguably America's most anti-racist voice over the past 2 decades, unwavering in her search for anti-racist explanations when others took the easier and racist way of Black blame. In her speech, she proposed a new abolitionism, pushing for a rethinking of prisons and how they function. 10 days later, President Bill Clinton endorsed basically a new slavery, a 3 strikes and you're outlaw. It was called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, giving hard time to certain 3-time offenders, which ended up causing the largest increase of the prison population in U.S. history, mostly on nonviolent drug offenses. Mostly Black men. Of course, this once more put fuel in the Black people are naturally criminals vehicle, a vehicle that had been driving fast for a long time, running over everything in its path. But there was another academic debate brewing on whether Black people were natural or nurtured fools. And this particular debate had serious political repercussions for Clinton's tough on Blacks, New Democrats, and the newest force in American politics, which pledged to be even tougher. Chapter 26, A Million Strong. Intelligence. What is it? This isn't a trick question, or maybe it is. Either way, it was what academics were talking about as Bill Clinton's crime laws drove the unintelligent Black narrative. What scholars were arguing is that intelligence is so relative, it's impossible to actually measure fairly and without bias. Uh-oh. This notion virtually shook the foundations of the racist ideas that Black people were less intelligent than white people, or that women were less intelligent than men, or that poor people were less intelligent than rich. It shook the idea that white schools were better, and even poked at the reason white students were perhaps going to wealthy white universities, and not because of intelligence, but because of racism, in the form of flawed and biased standardized testing. Enter Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray, Harvard guys. They wouldn't stand for this kind of talk. No, no, no. So they wrote a book refuting it all. It was called The Bell Curve: Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. The book argued that standardized testing was real and valid and, most important, fair, which then meant that Black people who were disproportionately doing poorly on these tests were intellectually inferior due to genetics or environment. I wish there was something new to add, but as you can see, the entire history was a recycling of the same racist ideas. Not the most original people, these racists. The year is 1994, and Herrnstein and Murray's book was published during the final stretch of the midterm elections. New Republicans issued their extremely tough Contract with America to take the welfare and crime issue back from Clinton's New Democrats. Funny how all the new things feel so old. Charles Murray jumped on board and started to rally voters and campaign for the Republicans by encouraging and rationalizing the anti-welfare bill called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Personal responsibility. This was another one of those get-overs. The mandate was simple enough. Black people, especially poor Black people, needed to take personal responsibility for their economic situation and for racial disparities, and stop blaming racism for their problems and depending on the government to fix them. It convinced a new generation of Americans that irresponsible Black people, not racism, caused the racial inequities. It sold the lie that racism has had no effect, so Black people should stop crying about it. It became a game of one-ups. The Democrats were tough on crime and welfare. The Republicans got tougher. Then the Democrats got tougher. Then the Republicans got tougher. So tough that they tried once more to get Angela Davis fired after University of California, Santa Cruz's facility awarded her the prestigious President's Chair professorship in January 1995. She was still a threat. But how could she be a threat while at the same time Republicans were claiming racism was over? What would she be threatening? What would she still be fighting? Why would she need to be fired? Not to mention, 1995 was a year that made clear that racism was far from over. 1995 was when the O.J. Simpson thing happened, the trial. I know you know about it. If not, he was accused of killing his wife and her friend, both white. The trial split the country in half, with Black people rooting for O.J.'s acquittal and white people rooting for his imprisonment. It was like watching the worst reality show of all time. The year 1995 was when the term super predator was created by Princeton University scholar John J. DiLulio to describe Black 14 to 17-year-olds. Murder rates were up among that age range, but so was unemployment. Of course, DiLulio left that part out. The year 1995 was also when the biggest political mobilization in Black American history took place, the Million Man March. It had been proposed by Louis Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam. Though the march was powerful in its groundswell, it was flawed in its sexism, which Angela Davis spoke out against the day before the march. The year 1995 was when activists would come together to defend the world's most famous Black male political prisoner, Mumia Abu-Jamal. He had been convicted of killing a white police officer in Philadelphia in 1982, though he claims innocence. A book of his commentaries was published that year, Live from Death Row. His execution was to be August 17, 1995, but because of the protests, Mumia was granted an indefinite stay of execution. And where was Bill Clinton when all this was going on? Not at the Million Man March, that's for sure. He was in Texas, pleading to evangelicals for racial healing. Instead of listening to the people dealing with it, he went to beg people not dealing with it to ask God to fix it. And of course, it slipped into pray God fixes Black people. Even though a year later, affirmative action was banned in California, making the playing field, especially as it pertained to higher education, more lopsided, the percentage of African Americans at University of California campuses began to decline, and the push for the end of affirmative action would spread, all under Bill Clinton's watch. A year later, in June 1997, Clinton gave a commencement address at Angela Davis's alma mater, UC San Diego. It was as if suddenly he'd seen the light, the irony, and pledged to lead the American people in a great and unprecedented conversation on race. Racial reformers applauded him, and Black women had something to say, a nudge, to get the conversation started. And when I say Black women, what I mean is 1 million of them. On October 25th, 1997, in Philadelphia, 1 million Black women gathered to have their voices heard. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Sister Souljah, Winnie Mandela, Atala and Elisa Shabazz, daughters of Malcolm X, and Dorothy Height all spoke. But so did white men, not at the march, but in the media. And what they argued in response to Clinton's statements was that the way to fix racism was to stop focusing on it. Wrong. But that's what they said. And that sentiment set the tone for what would become colorblindness. Pause. Take a breath. How many of you know the "I have a Black friend" person who then follows that statement with this one, "but I don't see color"? Yeah. Unpause. This colorblind rhetoric seemed to have its intended effect. Segregationists and assimilationists started favoring the colorblind product nearly a century after the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of separate but equal. And it had the same effect, lip service. The millennium was coming, and people still couldn't fathom equality because of color. But they used a new multicultural paint to brush over a racist stain, and a single coat wouldn't do. Chapter 27, A Bill Too Many. Want to know something incredible and strange, and both surprising yet not surprising at all? Scientific evidence that the races are 99.9% the same was brought forth on June 26, 2000. The year 2000 was when people were given scientific evidence that human beings were the same, despite the color of their skin. Isn't that wild? Bill Clinton delivered the news as if it were news. But Craig Venter, one of the scientists responsible, was more frank than Clinton in how he spoke about it. The concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis, Venter said. His research team at Celera Genomics had determined the genetic code of 5 individuals who were identified as either Hispanic, Asian, Caucasian, or African American, and the scientists could not tell one race from the other. But there was 0.1% still out there, and that 0.1% difference between humans must be racial. Whether it is or isn't, it was going to be exploited by racist scientists who did everything they could to provide evidence that the races were biologically different. First curse theory and polygenesis, and now genes. Racists were relentless. But they didn't get much traction. Months later, the United States report to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination pointed out what was now the broken U.S. race record. There had been substantial successes, but there were significant obstacles remaining. It was September 2000, and Texas Governor George W. Bush was pledging to restore honor and dignity to the White House, while Vice President Al Gore was trying to distance himself from Bill Clinton's impeachment scandal. The report's findings of discrimination and disparities across the American board did not become campaign talking points, as they reflected poorly on both the Clinton administration and the Republicans' colorblind America. Science says the races are biologically equal, so if they're not equal in society, the only reason why can be racism. And it played out again in the law a few months later, when tens of thousands of Black voters in Governor Jeb Bush's Florida were barred from voting or had their votes destroyed, allowing George W. Bush to win his brother's state by fewer than 500 votes. This racist act would end up leading George W. Bush to the presidency. But once in office, he also couldn't stop the anti-racist momentum. The reparations conversation had kicked into high gear, and nearly 12,000 women and men ventured to beautiful Durban, South Africa for the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, held from August 31st to September 7th, 2001. Delegates passed around a report on the prison industrial complex and women of color that had been co-authored by Angela Davis. They also identified the internet as the latest mechanism for spreading racist ideas, citing the roughly 60,000 white supremacist sites and the racist statements so often made in comment sections following online stories about Black people. The United States had the largest delegation, and anti-racist Americans established fruitful connections with activists from around the world, many of whom wanted to ensure that the conference kicked off a global anti-racist movement. As participants started venturing back to Senegal and the United States, Japan, Brazil, and France around September 7, 2001, they carried their anti-racist momentum around the world. And then it all came crashing down, literally. September 11th, 2001, after about 3,000 Americans heartbreakingly lost their lives in attacks on the World Trade Center, on the Pentagon, on United Airlines Flight 93 that went down in Pennsylvania, President Bush condemned the evildoers, the insane terrorists, all the while promoting anti-Islamic and anti-Arab sentiments. Colorblind racists exploited the raw feelings in the post 9/11 moment, playing up a united, patriotic America where anyone who wasn't waving a flag was in fact an enemy to the country. But there was no united front, not in the broad scheme of things. Affirmative action was still being challenged, and no one wanted to grapple with the fact that the issue was education could be better dealt with if the racial preferences of standardized testing were eradicated. But the use of standardized testing grew in K-12 schooling when the Bush administration's bipartisan No Child Left Behind Act took effect in 2003. The premise was simple: set high goals and test often to see if those goals are being met, and then fund the schools based on those results. And though it was called No Child Left Behind, it actually encouraged mechanisms that decreased funding to schools when students were not making improvements, thus leaving the neediest students behind. It once again put the blame on Black children and Black teachers and public schools, not on racist policies. And the worst part is that Black assimilationists bought in once more. People like Bill Cosby, who blamed Black parents. The lower economic people are not holding up their end in this deal. These people are not parenting, Cosby said in Washington, D.C. after being honored at an NAACP gala in May 9, 2004. They are buying things for kids, $500 sneakers for what? And they won't spend $200 for Hooked on Phonics. I am talking about these people who cry when their son is standing there in an orange suit. And while Bill Cosby took his racist ideas on the road for a speaking tour, a rising star of the Democratic Party, Barack Obama, subverted Cosby's message during his keynote address at the Democratic National Convention in Boston on July 27, 2004. Go into any inner city neighborhood, and folks will tell you that government alone can't teach kids to learn. They know that parents have to teach, that children can't achieve unless we raise their expectations and turn off the television sets and eradicate the slander that says a Black youth with a book is acting white. They know those things. A booming applause interrupted Obama as his takedown of Cosby's critique settled in. Obama presented himself as a racial and socioeconomic unicorn, humble beginnings and a lofty ascent, both native and immigrant ancestry, also both African and European ancestry. He checked every box. And though at the time he was campaigning for John Kerry, who would lose the election to George W. Bush, it was clear a star was born. Chapter 28, A Miracle and Still a Maybe. 2 weeks after his exhilarating keynote address, Barack Obama's memoir, Dreams from My Father, A Story of Race and Inheritance, was republished. It rushed up the charts and snatched rave reviews in the final months of 2004. Toni Morrison, the queen of American letters and the editor of Angela Davis's iconic memoir 3 decades earlier, deemed Dreams from My Father quite extraordinary. Obama had written the memoir in the racially packed year of 1995 as he prepared to begin his political career in the Illinois Senate. In the book, he claimed to be exempt from being an extraordinary Negro, but racist Americans of all colors would in 2004 begin hailing Barack Obama with all his public intelligence, morality, speaking ability, and political success as such. The extraordinary Negro hallmark had come a mighty long way from Phyllis Wheatley to Barack Obama, who became the nation's only African American in the U.S. Senate in 2005. With Phyllis Wheatley, racists despised the capable Black mind, but with Obama, they were turning their backs on history so that they could see him as a symbol of a post-racial America, an excuse to say the ugliness is over. But it was a devastating natural and racial disaster that summer that would burst the bubble of post-racial make-believe, and if anything, forced a tense debate about racism. During the final days of August 2005, Hurricane Katrina took more than 1,800 lives, forced millions to migrate, flooded the beautiful Gulf Coast, and caused billions in property damage. Hurricane Katrina blew the colorblind roof off of America and allowed all to see, if they dared to look, the dreadful progression of racism. For years, scientists and journalists had warned that if southern Louisiana took a direct hit from a major hurricane, the levees could fail and the region, a poor Black community, would be flooded and destroyed. No one did anything. And once it happened, the response from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, was delayed. It was rumored that the Bush administration directed FEMA to delay its response in order to amplify the destructive reward for those who would benefit. Whether or not this is true, they were delayed, and people were drowning. It took 3 days to deploy rescue troops to the Gulf Coast region, more time than it took to get troops on the ground to quell the 1992 Rodney King Rebellion. And then came the media, this time spinning tales of looting and gruesome, sensationalized stories of children in the Superdome where people were being sheltered, having their throats cut. In the era of colorblind racism, no matter how gruesome the racial crime, no matter how much evidence was stacked against them, racists were standing before the judge and pleading not guilty. But how many criminals actually confess when they don't have to? From civilizers to standardized testers, assimilationists have rarely confessed to racism. Enslavers and Jim Crow segregationists went to their graves claiming innocence. And just as many presidents before him have, including Reagan, Lincoln, and Jefferson, George W. Bush will likely do the same. On February 10, 2007, Barack Obama stood in front of the old Capitol building in Springfield, Illinois, and formally announced his presidential candidacy. He stood on the same spot where Abraham Lincoln had delivered his historic House Divided speech in 1858. Obama brimmed with words of American unity, hope, and change. No one saw him coming. As a matter of fact, everyone said Hillary Clinton was the inevitable choice until Obama came through Iowa and snatched it from under her nose. By February 5, 2008, Super Tuesday, the Tuesday in the presidential election season when the greatest number of states hold primary elections, Americans had been swept up in the Obama Yes We Can crusade of hope and change, themes he embodied and spoke about so eloquently in his speeches that people started to hunger for him. But in mid-February, his perceptive and brilliant wife, Michelle Obama, told a Milwaukee rally, "For the first time in my adult life, I am really proud of my country, and not just because Barack has done well, but because I think people are hungry for change." That's all racists needed to pounce and call her unpatriotic, to try to tear the Obamas down and discredit them. Racist commentators became obsessed with Michelle Obama's body, her near 6-foot chiseled and curvy frame simultaneously semi-masculine and hyper-feminine. They searched for problems in her Black marriage and family, calling them extraordinary when they did not find any. Then they found a scapegoat in one of Black America's most revered liberation theologians, the recently retired pastor of Chicago's large Trinity United Church of Christ, Jeremiah Wright. He'd officiated at the Obama's wedding and spoke honestly about his feelings for a country that had worked overtime to kill him and his people. But the media used Wright's critiques of America to slander Obama. Obama tried to brush it off. tried to downplay his relationship with Pastor Wright, but nothing was working. So instead, he delivered the speech of his life. It was called A More Perfect Union. It was a speech on race, and it teetered back and forth between painful assimilationist thought and bold anti-racism. And it worked. It pushed him on past the barrage of obstacles to come, including the one fueled by Donald Trump that challenged whether or not Obama was an American. And on November 4th, 2008, a 64-year-old recently retired professor, Angela Davis, cast a vote for a major political party for the first time in her voting life. She had retired from academia, but not from her very public activism of 4 decades. She was still traveling the country trying to rouse an abolitionist movement against prisons. In casting her vote for Democratic Barack Obama, Davis joined roughly 69.5 million Americans. But more than voting for the man, Davis voted for the grassroots effort of the campaign organizers, those millions of people demanding change. When the network started announcing that Obama had been elected the 44th president of the United States, happiness exploded from coast to coast. It burst from the United States and spread around the anti-racist world. Davis was in the delirium of Oakland. People whom she did not know came up and hugged her as she walked the streets. She saw people singing to the heavens and saw people dancing in the streets. And the people Angela Davis saw and all the others around the world who were celebrating were not enraptured from the election of an individual. They were enraptured by the pride of the victory for Black people, by the success of millions of grassroots organizers. And because they had shown all those disbelievers who had said that electing a Black president was impossible to be wrong. Most of all, they were enraptured by the anti-racist potential of a Black president. But, like my mother says, there's not much payout for potential, is there? President Obama was a symbol, yes, one of hope, one of progress, but also one of assimilationism. So much so that he was used to explain racism away, used to absolve it. Obama fell in line with the likes of Lincoln, Du Bois, Washington, Douglass, and many others who had flashes, true moments of anti-racist thought, but always seemed to assimilate under pressure. He rose to fame for calling out Bill Cosby for blaming Black people, then dived headfirst into assimilation shortly thereafter, critiquing Black people in the exact same ways. And just as with the Black leaders before him, the assimilation didn't work. Segregationists climbed out of every hateful hole and out from under every racist rock. They hated him, worked tirelessly to destroy and discredit him, and used him as a way to demean Black people, to ramp up racist absurdity and stereotypes, once again calling back to their favorite bigoted playlist, playing all the classic racist tunes: Black Savage, Black Dummy, Black Do Nothing, Black Be Nothing. Anything to smear President Obama and Black people in the media. Racist politicians and media personalities worked to figure out ways to tamp down the ego that they assumed came with a Black president, and came with being Black in the time of a Black president, and came with being Black. People started to die. People continued to die. Children's lives ended at the hands of police officers and vigilantes who placed no value on Black humanity. Police officers and vigilantes who walk free. But just like in other parts of America's racist history, anti-racists push forth from the margins to fight back, Black president or not. Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi founded #Black Lives Matter as a direct response to racist backlash in the form of police brutality. From the minds and hearts of these 3 Black women, 2 of whom are queer, this declaration of love intuitively signified that in order to truly be anti-racist, we must also oppose all the sexism, homophobia, colorism, ethnocentrism, nativism, cultural prejudice, and class bias teeming with racism to harm so many Black lives. The anti-racist declaration of the era quickly leaped from social media onto shouting signs and shouting mouths at anti-racist protests across the country in 2014. These protesters rejected the racist declaration of 6 centuries that Black lives don't matter. Hashtag Black Lives Matter quickly transformed from an anti-racist love declaration into an anti-racist movement filled with young people operating in local BLM groups across the nation, often led by young Black women. Collectively, these activists were pressing against discrimination in all forms, in all areas of society, and from a myriad of vantage points. And in reaction to those who acted as if Black male lives mattered the most, anti-racist feminists boldly demanded of America to #say her name, to shine light on the women who had also been affected by the hands and feet of racism. Perhaps they, the anti-racist daughters of Davis, should be held up as symbols of hope for taking potential and turning it into power. More important, perhaps we should all do the same. Here's the afterword. How do you feel? I mean, I hope after reading this not history book, you've left with some answers. I hope it's clear how the construct of race has always been used to gain and keep power, whether financially or politically. How it has always been used to create dynamics that separate us to keep us quiet, to keep the ball of white and rich privilege rolling, and that it's not woven into people as much as it's woven into policy that people adhere to and believe is truth. Laws that have kept Black people from freedom, from voting, from education, from insurance, from housing, from government assistance, from healthcare, from shopping, from walking, from driving, from breathing. Laws that treat Black human beings like nothing. No, like animals. Let's go with that. Animals. If we call a particular person a dog long enough, someone who is not like that person or who has more power than that person will believe it, especially if we give the powerful person a leash and justify putting it around the oppressed person's neck. If we justify feeding them dog food, if we muzzle them when they bark, claiming that their barks as well as their whines are violent, if we clip their tail, their ears, punish them when they chew up the house, when they gnaw at the wooden door. And if we can convince the person with power that a child is a dog, if we present fraudulent pedigree papers, why would they even question humans as dogs being considered pets, being owned, trained, used, bred, and sold? This is how racism works. I mean, all it takes is the right kind of media to spark it, to spin it. At least that's what history has shown us. Tell a certain story a certain way. Make a movie that paints you as the hero. Get enough people on your side to tell you you're right and you're right, even if you're wrong. And once you've been told you're right long enough, and once your being right has led you to a profitable and privileged life, you do anything to not be proved wrong. Even pretend human beings aren't human beings. From Zurara to Harriet Beecher Stowe, Sojourner Truth to Audre Lorde, Ida B. Wells Barnett to Zora Neale Hurston, Frederick Douglass to Marcus Garvey, Jack Johnson to Muhammad Ali, Tarzan to Planet of the Apes, Ma Rainey to Public Enemy, Langston Hughes to James Baldwin, Cotton Mather to Thomas Jefferson, to William Lloyd Garrison, to W.E.B. Du Bois, to Angela Davis, leads back to the question of whether you, reader, want to be a segregationist, a hater, an assimilationist, a coward, or an anti-racist, someone who truly loves. Choice is yours. Don't freak out. Just breathe in, inhale, hold it. Now exhale slowly. Now.